If I asked you what the most influential alternate history comic book was, you would probably say Watchmen. But there is another work of sequential art that you should know about, one that puts the British Empire in space! Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and today we're going to discuss Ministry of Space. Ministry of Space is a short-form, Sidewise Award-winning, 3-part alternate history comic book written by Warren Ellis, who also wrote Ocean, another comic about space exploration that I enjoyed, and the art was done by Chris Weston. It was published by Image Comics between 2001 and 2004, with the first 2 issues published in 2001, before the last was published in 2004. Wait, seriously? 3 years to finish a 3-issue book? I mean, look at the trade paperback. It's not even that thick. Although, I guess I shouldn't make fun, because at the rate Resliders is going, I'll be 83 when that's finished. Ellis, an admitted space enthusiast, said Ministry of Space was inspired by Dan Dare, a 1950s British comic set in a future where Britain leads the way in space exploration. Rediscovering these comics prompted Ellis to ask the question, what if Britain went to space in the 1950s? A question which is not as crazy as it sounds. You see, Britain was a leader in jet propulsion for the Allies during World War II, and their Gloucester Meteor was the only Allied jet to be used in combat. The British also had a scientific interest in space exploration thanks to groups like the British Interplanetary Society, which included among its members noted science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke, who penned 2001: A Space Odyssey, a book that was certainly 100% realistic on life in the 21st century. Although instead of moon bases and missions to Jupiter, we got an increasing number of people who believe the Earth is flat. Unfortunately, post-war Britain was economically devastated from World War II, and the empire was shedding colonies. Thus, Britain had neither the money nor the political will to invest in a massive space program like the Americans and Soviets were doing in our timeline. In fact, being the main targets of German rockets also meant that your average Briton was more interested in punishing rocket scientists rather than paying them to create a space program. Nevertheless, Britain did test V-2 rockets, and Ralph Smith from the British Interplanetary Society proposed a plan to put a man in space using a V-2 in 1946, but this was rejected by the government due to a lack of funds. That said, according to David Baker, a former NASA engineer, Ralph's design was practical and could have put a man in space before the Soviets or the Americans. An official British space program began in 1952, but it was mostly dependent on American rockets to get their satellites into orbit. Britain eventually gained the capacity to put their own satellites into orbit, but they did not keep at it for long. As Andrew Weston noted in his 2008 article for the Space Review, Britain was the only country to gain and then abandon the capacity to launch objects into space. Britain also never had its own astronaut corps. In fact, the first British person to go to space, Helen Sharman, did so as a cosmonaut on a Soviet rocket in 1991, which seems like it belongs in the timeline where the Soviet Union won the Cold War, but it was actually our timeline. Today, the UK Space Agency is investing in a space plane called Skylon to reach space, but at the moment they are behind the other spacefaring nations. Now, alternate historians exploring different paths for the British space program isn't anything new. In fact, such timelines are pretty popular with the users of alternatehistory.com, and they even have an article for such timelines on their wiki, which jokingly blames Harold Wilson for Britain's space failure. Examples of this particular trope include Paul Macaulay's 2000 short story A Very British History, which can be found online, and I do recommend that you read it, and David Atwell's web original The Human Timeline, which can be found on Changing the Times. Although The Human Timeline focuses mostly on the far future, it does begin as an alternate history where the UK takes a greater interest in space exploration. But are such stories, like Ministry of Space, plausible? Well, let's take a look at this comic's timeline and find out. BTW, I'm going to drop some major spoilers, including the twist that comes at the end of the story. So if you don't want that ruined, go and read Ministry of Space now. Still with me? Good. Let's begin. In the summer of 1945, as World War II in Europe is winding down, Air Commodore John Dashwood has completed an operation to seize all of the German rocket engineers from Peenemünde, Germany. To prevent any of their rocket technology from falling into the hands of the Americans or Soviets, the site is bombed, killing several American soldiers sent to secure it. Now, this is somewhat difficult to pull off. According to a story in YouTuber Amy Shira Title in her book Breaking the Chains of Gravity, Werner von Braun, who led the German rocket program and would later be a part of America's own space efforts, had evacuated his team from Peenemünde towards southern Germany, taking advantage of conflicting orders to save his scientists from being forced to fight a last stand against the advancing Red Army. Instead, von Braun hoped to surrender to the Americans, which he did in May 1945. Okay, so we're already playing fast and loose with history for this timeline to make sense, which isn't really good. But let's see what happens next. Dashwood later approaches Prime Minister Winston Churchill about using the captured German rocket engineers to create the Ministry of Space, which will expand the British Empire into the stars. Churchill is initially skeptical, but is convinced to create the ministry due to fears that America is keeping things from Britain, like the nuclear bomb they are building, and the fact that the new ministry will be paid for by what Dashwood calls a black budget. The black budget is a major plot point, so remember that for later. Now, throughout the first issue, Ellis seems to imply that America was keeping their desire to capture the German rocket scientists and the nuclear bomb they were building from the British, but that seems unlikely. In our timeline, America and Britain cooperated scientifically during the war. Many captured German rocket scientists were even sent to Britain so the British could evaluate their rockets. The British were also aware of the American nuclear bomb project, aka the Manhattan Project, and both sides shared information with each other, except for a brief period in 1942 and 43 when distrust between the two nations ended any scientific cooperation. This was resolved by the 1943 Quebec Agreement, where America and Britain combined their nuclear efforts. In hindsight, perhaps this is the actual point of divergence in the Ministry of Space timeline. The Quebec Agreement is never signed, and thus the British government decides to go their own way in the post-war world. Meanwhile, the changes to the timeline butterflies away von Braun's attempt to escape Peenemünde, and thus has to be rescued by the British rather than surrender to the Americans. Granted, this is just speculation on my part. Ellis never really gives any details about why American and British relations deteriorated so rapidly at the end of World War II. Back to the timeline. With the Ministry of Space created and funded, the British space program makes some major advancements. In 1946, the British V-3 is launched in front of British industrialists who Dashwood attempts to impress. In 1948, the British put the first satellite named Victory in orbit. Finally, in 1950, Dashwood personally flies a rocket plane, called Britannia, out of the atmosphere, making him the first man in space. Unfortunately, eventually goes as well as Brexit is going, and the plane crashes in the British countryside. Dashwood survives, but he did lose his legs, although he is knighted for his efforts. As a side note, the Britannia is loosely based on Chuck Yeager's plane, the Bell X-1, that broke the sound barrier in our timeline. Ellis presumes it could have reached space if it had a bigger engine, which would have meant America could have put a man in space before the Soviets. Based on what little research I did, I think this is plausible, as it certainly matches what other space-plane concepts like the aforementioned Skylon are proposing to do. That said, if you know better than I do, which is more than likely, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Anywho, there are several more Britannia flights before 1953, when his three-stage rocket, called Elizabeth II, is launched to coincide with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The plan is to put the second stage in orbit in order to link them together to create a space station that will be called Churchill Station. Meanwhile, the third stage is a modified Britannia ship with room for more passengers. Later, in 1956, we get our first and only discussion of geopolitical changes to the timeline. In this alternate timeline, Britain recognizes Egyptian control of the Suez Canal without much fuss. In our timeline, however, Egypt's seizure of the canal led to an invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel before political pressure from pretty much everyone forced them to back down. This episode was called the Suez Crisis, but in the timeline of Ministry of Space, Britain is less interested in maintaining their terrestrial empire and prefers to focus on space. Otherwise, we just don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. How is decolonization going for Britain elsewhere? How is America handling the Cold War now they're not allied with Britain? We can only guess. What we do know is that by 1957, the spaceship Victoria, constructed in orbit at Churchill Station and carrying a crew of 25, is launched for the moon. Upon landing, the British claim the moon as theirs. Also, the National Service Act of 1948, an act of Parliament which extended conscription long after World War II, is not abolished and is open to the Royal Space Force. In 1960, von Braun dies, but by the time he does, we see the retrofuturistic London that he helped build, with kids using helicopter backpacks, rocket planes flying overhead, boats with hydrofoils on the Thames, and elevated trains. I should take a moment and say that Weston's artwork is just fantastic. A hearty thumbs up to you, my man. Meanwhile, Britain is testing a nuclear rocket, which unfortunately explodes during liftoff at Woomera, Australia in 1962, killing everyone on board along with nearby observers. Honestly, this isn't the first alternate history I read with a disaster involving a nuclear rocket. Stephen Baxter's 1996 novel Voyage also had a similar catastrophe. It's an odd little cliche that perhaps reflects our fear of nuclear power, but let's not dig too deep into that at the moment. Despite the disaster at Woomera, Britain lands humans on Mars in 1969, after sending a fleet of ships there to establish a colony, similar to the idea von Braun proposed in our timeline in his book, The Mars Project. Flash forward 3 decades later, and in 2001, Britain is full of jetpacks and other futuristic gizmos. In space, there's a manned mission to Saturn, dome farms on Mars, cities on the moon, colonies built into asteroids, and multiple space stations in Earth orbit, all flying the Union Jack. Unfortunately, it appears that racial segregation is still a thing in this alternate 21st century Britain, suggesting that despite all the technological advancements, socially speaking, Britain is stuck a few decades behind the rest of the world. Anywho, this alternate Britain is about to get a wake-up call when the Americans are set to launch their very first rocket for a lunar orbital mission, and to prevent the British from interfering, they threaten to expose exactly where the money from the black budget that funded the Ministry of Space came from. Okay. First, I find it hard to believe that it would take America almost 50 years before they launched their own manned mission to space. Yes, the German scientists the Americans captured at the end of World War II were important in launching America's rockets, but it's not like America didn't have their own homegrown rocket scientists, like Robert H. Goddard, who built the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. So the idea that American space exploration would be decades behind just because Britain stole all of the German rocketeers is frankly impossible. Second, I told you that the black budget would be an important plot point, and here is why. Sir John Dashwood explains to the Ministry of Space that he used gold, money, and other assets taken from Holocaust victims by the Nazis, roughly £2 billion, to fund Britain's adventures in space. The ministry officials are horrified, but Dashwood is not remorseful in the slightest. While the ministry officials think they are ruined, Dashwood claims he saved them from austerity, gave them space, and kept the English free from outside influence. He defiantly declares that England won't care what he did to make them great. And I hate to say it, but he's probably right, at least about Britain not caring. In Ministry of Space, Britain kills allies, steals from Holocaust victims, and attempts to keep British culture stagnant and isolated. This all seems bad, but how much worse is it from what the British did to create and keep their empire in our timeline? I'm sure everyone has seen the meme about how Britain is portrayed in their history books versus how the rest of the world portrays them, and it makes a lot of sense, sadly. The wealth from Britain's colonies made them into a world-class power, but it came with the toil and suffering of others. And the British generally had little concern for their welfare when it came to expanding and maintaining their empire. And that's how we got the concentration camps of the Second Boer War, the Amritsar massacre, or the Bengali famine of 1943, just to name a few atrocities. Unfortunately, you still get people who are so fond of the Age of Empire that they either ignore the darker aspects of their history, or, worse yet, declare anyone who criticizes their country as traitors. And it's not just Britain that does this. My own country has a troubled history when it comes to empire building. How many native tribes had to be kicked out of their homes or outright massacred to create the industrial and agricultural heartland of America? Or how much money was raised by enslaving millions of Americans for centuries? Asking these questions often causes a nasty backlash, which makes it hazardous to bring them up in the first place. Nevertheless, it certainly proves Dashwood's point that most of Britain probably won't care what sins were done to give them the stars, and some may even applaud him for it. And that is not only a powerful bit of social commentary from Ellis, it's also the most plausible part of Ministry of Space. So, final thoughts? Overall, I find Ministry of Space to be not that plausible. There are just way too many things left vague, unclear, or sometimes just flat out impossible for the timeline to work. Nevertheless, it really is a plausible look at how human suffering is used to build empires, whether they be terrestrial or interstellar, and how there will always be people willing to argue the ends justify the means. I definitely recommend checking out Ministry of Space for that reason alone. Well, that is all to say in the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.